Hi, I'm James Catherall, a co-founder of Catherall Audio, and today I want to talk about loading samples in the new MainStage sampler. So with MainStage Update 3.5 came the new sampler, and this is the replacement of the EXS24. The sampler is MainStage's way of letting you load pre-recorded and pre-created audio files that can then be triggered in your MainStage concert. This would be something similar to like the Roland SP404, which is a hardware sampler that people use. One of the nice things about this new sampler is it is cross-compatible with the old EXS24. So if you have any samplers you've created in the EXS24, they'll still work in the new sampler and vice versa. Anything you've created in the new sampler will work in the EXS24. So you don't have to worry if you're working on two different machines that have two different versions of MainStage. So let's get looking inside of our concert. I am here in edit mode in my MainStage concert. I have a channel strip ready right here. I'm going to load in the new sampler. Right here where it says instrument, I'm going to click on this to open the drop-down menu. And I want to go where it says sampler, multi-sample. And I'm going to click on stereo. And this is going to open up our interface. Let's look up here at this top area of the interface. We have 5 different windows: the synth, the mod matrix, the modulators, mapping, and zone. It's going to bring me to one of the first things I don't really like about this new sampler is by default, it only has the synth, mod matrix, and modulators open. And I usually only work in the mapping and the zone area. That's where I'm most commonly making edits in the sampler. I haven't found a way to change it so that that's open by default. So if you happen to know how to do that, leave a comment down below. So here I'm going to open the mapping and zone by clicking on these buttons next to it. And now we can see here's our mapping window and our zone window. So let's work on loading in an audio file. This is going to bring me to number 2 thing that I don't really like about this new sampler. So typically when I'm loading in a sample into the sampler, like in the EXS24, I would just click and drag from my Finder into this piano area, and then that would load the sample. But now what happens for me if I go over here and I click on the Finder, it then hides that sampler window behind my MainStage concert. And so I can't just click and drag easily. So if you know how to change that so that it doesn't happen anymore, then now leave a comment for that down below. So let's go back to the sampler and load in our samples. I'm going to go up here where it says zone. I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to click on load audio files. And this is going to open up our Finder window. So here I can locate my samples and then load them into the sampler, and I can load as many as I want. So one quick sidebar with your audio files, you want to make sure you're using either WAV or AIFF files. You want to stay away from MP3 files in the sampler. So I'm going to start by clicking on just this vocal sample and hitting open. Now by default, it's loaded that sample on the C1 key. I'm going to check out a few areas that I use most commonly in the interface. Look here with the root key, this pitch button, the volume, this key area, and then the one-shot button. So starting with the root key. The root key is telling me what note is going to trigger the original audio file as I created it. So we can demonstrate that by stretching this sample across the keyboard a little bit more. I'm going to drag the edges in either direction. Now, the sampler is going to change the pitch of the sample based off of how far away from the root key I trigger the sample. So let's start by triggering the original sample. And next, I'm going to go up to the E flat. So that's going to be 1, 2, 3 semitones up. Or I can go down to the A and it's going to make it lower. So if you noticed, when it changed the pitch, it also changed the speed, and we can turn that off if we want to. If I go down here to this little bendy waveform button, and click on that, and now even when the pitch changes, it won't alter the speed of the sample. You can play them all at the same time too. Typically in the sampler, the only thing that I want to change is the volume. I don't really like doing a lot of pitch changing in the sampler. I'll usually do that in my DAW and get the sample ready there before I bounce it out into the sampler. So I'm going to turn all that off right there. And then if I click the pitch button, it's going to stop altering the pitch even if I play it on different keys. So I usually always turn off the pitch button right away when I load in a sample. Next, we can look at the volume area. I can click and drag these numbers up or down to change the volume of the sample that I have selected. You can also double click and type in a number and hit enter, and that will also change the volume. Next, we can look at this key area. That's telling me what keys the sample is mapped to. So this is the lowest key and the highest key that the sample will be triggered on. I'm going to double click these and bring it back to just C1. You also noticed when I trigger the sample, when I lift my finger, the sample stops immediately. I can also stop that by clicking on this one-shot button. When that's turned on, anytime I trigger the sample, it's always going to play it from beginning to end. For the most part, I usually have my samples as one-shots, but sometimes there's some samples that I do want to have more of a sustain instead of just a one-shot. So if I turn that off, I can also change the release behavior of the sample. So right now when I press it and let go, it stops immediately, and that sounds really unnatural. So let's change that. I'm going to scroll up. I'm going to look right here in this modulator window. I'm going to look over here. It says ENV1 amp. And what that means is envelope 1 amplitude. And so that amplitude is referring to the volume of these samples. So I'm going to look right here where you see the R. Right now it's set to 0 milliseconds. So that means as soon as I release my finger off of the key, it's going to stop the sample after 0 milliseconds, which is immediately. I can change that by dragging up. I'm going to go to 1,000. And this is measured in milliseconds. So 1,000 milliseconds is about 1 second. So now when I trigger the sample and then release, instead of stopping immediately, it fades out over 1 second down to silence. So that can be really useful to make the sample sound a little bit more natural if you're not using the one-shot button. I'm going to bring that back down to 0, and I'm going to turn the one-shot button back on. Now, if I want to move the sample to a different key instead of C1, to me what's easiest is I can just click on the sample itself, and I can start dragging it around. But what's going to happen if I start moving up and down, we can see that it moves in this vertical space, and that's changing how the sample is going to be triggered based off of the velocity. And I don't want that to happen. Unless you really know what you're doing, you want to keep it in the original 0 to 127 velocity range. So I'm going to bring it back down to there and release. And now what I can do so that doesn't happen is I'm going to hold Command, and then I'm going to drag the sample around. And you can see even though I'm moving up and down vertically, it doesn't move the sample vertically anymore. I'm going to move it over to F1, and then I'm going to release. You can see when I do that, it also changes the root key, which is good. That's what I want to happen right now too. Now let's say you have two different samples that you want to load onto the same key. If you're used to using the EXS24, this was pretty simple. You could just click and drag your samples from the Finder and put them on the same key, and it would automatically stack them for you so you could trigger multiple samples from one key. In the new sampler, it's still pretty easy, but we just have one extra step we need to add on. So let's start by talking about a couple terms we need to understand. There are zones and there are groups. A zone is basically just a sample. So anytime you hear the word zone, just think about that as one sample. Now, a group is a collection of zones. So in this sampler, I can only have one zone on each key. So if I have multiple different samples and I want to put them on different keys, then I can keep all of that in one group and just start loading them on all of these different keys. But if I want to put two different samples on the same key, I'm going to need to start adding new groups. I can do that by going up to the Group tab and hitting New. And now we've created a new group. And we can see that this group is empty, but if we go back to Group 1, this one still has our sample that we loaded in already. So let's load a sample into Group 2. I'm going to go to Zone, Load Audio File, and this time I want to load this sample. I'm going to hit Open. So now, once again, it put it on the C1 key by default. I'm going to turn off pitch. I'm going to turn on one shot. And now I'm going to hold Command and drag this sample over to F1 and then release. And now when I press the F1 key, we're going to hear both samples at the same time. So you can stack multiple samples onto one key. You just need to keep adding more groups. So every one sample that you want on a key, you need a new group for that sample. Another default behavior of the sampler is when you trigger a sample, it will change the volume of that sample based off of how hard or soft you pressed the key. And usually I don't like that to happen. So let's work on changing that. If I scroll up back to the modulators window, I'm going to look back here at envelope 1 amplitude. And here where it says VEL, that stands for velocity. This is what's changing the volume of the samples based off of the velocity. So I'm going to take that all the way down to 0. So now it's not going to change the sample at all based off of velocity. There is also another way that I can achieve this. If I go up here to the synth window and I click on details and then velocity offset, I'm going to drag that up to 127. So what that's doing is anytime I trigger a sample, it's going to take the input velocity and it's going to add 127 to it, which will always bring it to the maximum. So that way I know that the sample is always going to be the same volume because it's always going to be triggered at max velocity. So both of these solutions achieve the same thing. You don't need to do both of them. You can just do one or the other. Now I'm going to talk about one other method to achieve this same thing that for me is my preferred method, but it's going to happen outside of the sampler interface. So I'm going to go up here and click the X to close the sampler, and I'm going to add a new software instrument, hit create. And I'm going to look up here in the MIDI FX area. I'm going to add in the velocity processor. I'm going to change the mode to value range, and then I'm going to pull that up to 127. So now what that's doing is pretty similar to the velocity offset. Now it's going to take the input velocity and it's just going to change it to 127. So no matter what the input velocity was or how hard you press the key, it's always going to output 127 into the sampler. So I like this because it happens outside of the sampler interface and it only affects the channel strip that it's on. It doesn't affect any other channel strip that doesn't have the velocity processor. So I'm going to close that. I'm going to load in another sampler here. And this is going to be an empty sampler. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this as a preset. So that way for the future, if I want to create a new sampler, I can load this sampler preset and have that velocity processor on it all the time, and I don't have to worry about changing the settings inside of the sampler interface. So if I go up to here where it says manual, and then save channel strip setting. Now I can save this as default sampler and hit save. Now let's test it by adding another channel strip, hitting create, and then up at the top again. And go here to user channel strip settings and we can see default sampler that we just created. If I click that, now it has this new channel strip, velocity, and it's still set up the same way that we did it before. So now that just makes it convenient. Anytime you're going to create a new sampler in MainStage, you can just load that default sampler preset, and now that velocity processor will be there all the time, so you don't have to worry about changing it in the sampler interface. Now let's work on one final step. I'm going to open up this original sampler we created, and now I have everything set up the way I want it to be, and I want to save it so that it'll stay the same for the future. I'm going to go up here where it says user default, and then I'm going to click Save As. Now, what I would suggest when you're saving these samplers is I would create a new folder and name it after the project that you're working on. So that way, all of these samplers that you create will all be in the same folder and you'll always know where they are. So I'm going to click New Folder. I'm going to name these YouTube Sampler and hit Create. And now I'm going to name the sampler Sampler 1, and then I'm going to hit Save. And now I can see it's changed it to Sampler 1. And if I click on this again, I can go down here to YouTube Sampler, and this is where all my samplers will be that I create. And now once I've saved this, if I make any additional changes, I can just push Command S to save it, or I can click on the drop-down menu and click Save right there. And that's how to load samples into your MainStage concert and get them ready to be triggered. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button. If you have any MainStage topics you'd like for us to cover, leave a comment down below. And we'll see you in the next one.